A little bit better. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with my computer.
Oh.
It's hot though.
Does anybody have a fairly good idea when the legislature will wrap up? I'm hearing Wednesday, but then you never know. Does anyone know?
Sure. Yeah, she has a meeting.
That sounds about right. I know that's what they're shooting for, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. That's what I was told, so I just,
I suspect they're going to punt some work until veto day. So
Yeah.
they won't be able to wrap it all up between now and then, but they can put a hold on some of it.
And you
are you
can,
feeling still confident about the 55%, Ryan, that she's thinking for schools?
It seems like it. I haven't heard a ton of pushback on that provision, our provision, some of the other education ones. So far, so good.
Okay, thank you.
Just so everybody's aware, we are live on YouTube.
Well, it is 9 o'clock. Just take a quick scan. Let's use.
Wait a minute. Oh. How do you move it closer?
We have enough for a quorum, Trustee Donnelly. Thank you, Ellen. Would you call the roll, please? You might want to call the meeting to order first. Thank you. I'll call the meeting of the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee to order. And Ellen, would you call the roll? Certainly. Trustee Kane.
here. Good morning.
Trustee Doak.
He was just here.
Yeah, he was. I'll come back to him. Trustee Donnelly. Here. And has Trustee Irwin joined us? Don't see him. Trustee Gardner.
Yes, you.
Trustee McMahon.
Here.
Trustee Riley.
Here.
Trustee Rotundo.
Here.
And I know we do have some non-committee member trustees joining us. I know Irene Neal is with us, Sven Bartholomew, and Roger Cates.
I think I'm going to be on the committee. Maybe I'm not yet, but
Correct.
I'm happy to be here. Okay.
And has Tim joined us back? No, I see he's on, but he hasn't unmuted. So we're ready to start.
Trustee Irwin and Trustee Kane are on as well.
Trustee Kane is on. I don't believe Trustee Irwin. Oh, he just joined. Yes, he is. We're all set.
Great, thank you. And could I have a motion for the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee of the Board of Trustees to go into an executive session under the provision of 1 MRSA Section 405(6)(c) to discuss the condition, acquisition, or disposition of real property or economic development if prematurely disclosed if premature disclosure of the information would prejudice the competitive or bargaining position of UMS.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Thank you.
Second.
And Ellen, would you call the roll?
Certainly. Trustee King.
Yes.
Trustee Donnelly.
Yes.
Trustee Irwin.
Yes.
Trustee Gardner.
Yes.
Trustee McMahon.
Yes.
Trustee Riley,
Yes.
trustee Rotundo.
Yes.
The motion is carried.
Thank you. Everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And sorry for being a little tardy returning to the public session of the Finance Facilities and Technology Committee meeting. I will reconvene the meeting and welcome everyone to the meeting. A reminder to participants to leave their mic muted when they are not speaking. And we're going to introduce the first item and turn the meeting over to Ryan Lowe. So the first item on tab 1, FY 2022 updated proposal for operating budget and student charges, second reading. And Vice Chancellor Lowe, please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I should be fairly brief here. The committee has had several discussions about the fiscal year 22 budget. I will note included in your board materials is the full 40, 50 slide PowerPoint presentation that you're welcome to review. But again, this committee's had a chance to see that 3 or 4 times, and I'll be presenting it to the full committee later in the month. So I won't walk you through the same slides for a third or fourth time. Instead, I'll try to do this in a condensed version and show you a one-page spreadsheet that really captures everything. So just a reminder, we have about a 10-month long budget process. We started this back about almost a year ago. In the summer, we really get started in October is when we kick into what we refer to as kind of the campus budget development phase after we've given everyone those big assumptions that you need to develop a budget. So the campuses went through the fall and into the winter, developing those budgets, held several campus forums, and we started having conversations with trustees in the late January, February timeframe. We met with this committee in the last week of March and presented the FY22 budget in its first reading. At the chair's request, we came back on April the 9th for a little bit longer Q&A with the committee to talk about some of the details, give committee members an opportunity to ask all of the questions that they had. We came back in May, early May, with the anticipation that we would be looking for a final committee vote. And then we'd go to the trustees later in the month, but made the decision to kind of pause as things were happening in Augusta. And so when we started developing this budget, we were working from an assumption that state appropriation would be flat over the 2-year state budget cycle, and certainly over fiscal year 22 for the University of Maine system. Always happy to be pleasantly surprised when that changes. And so we were incredibly grateful when Governor Mills put in a change package to her budget a couple of weeks ago that included a 3% increase for all of the higher eds. It included some targeted resources to Maine law, and that budget has continued to work its way through the legislative process. That caused us to pause and reconsider the impact of the in-state tuition proposal that we had originally included in the budget. So we did take out that 2.5% increase at the committee's request. We've done all of that juggling over the last few weeks, and so let me personally thank all of the presidents, all of the chief business officers across the system, all of the folks that are involved in putting these budgets together. It's not easy to work on one version for 8 or 9 months, make a big change like that, and then within 2 weeks come back with another version, but folks were up for the challenge. I mean, I do think we've ended up in a better spot, as we often do the more time we have these conversations. And so I will proceed to share my share my screen here and show you in a pretty simple format, although it certainly wasn't simple, how we got back into a balanced budget position. So starting on the left side of this spreadsheet, the committee will be familiar that with our original budget gap, the numbers have changed just a little bit, but we've been operating with a projected deficit of somewhere between 7 and 9.5 million for several months now. Most of that gap being driven at just a couple of our campuses. Since the last version that the committee saw, as I had mentioned, we did adjust the main law number. So we included the increased costs associated with the move downtown. We included the costs associated with operating the law school. And so this number right here grew by about 1.5 million. The rest of these numbers are generally in the ballpark of what the committee has seen for several months. The impact of the move to keep in-state tuition at 0 in fiscal year 22, while again, a positive impact for all of our students, it does have a negative impact on the bottom line. In this case, about 4.1 million. It brings us to a new revised gap of about 13.5 million for fiscal year 22. We resolved that largely through what I'll call 3 buckets. The first one is federal funding. I think the committee is aware. We've been fortunate to receive 3 rounds of federal support, 3 rounds of institutional dollars that are helping mitigate the impact of the pandemic. We used the bulk of those dollars, about $27 million in 2021 to get our campus budgets back into balance. For those campuses that continue to have federal dollars left, they are using about 5 million in the upcoming fiscal year to get that budget back into balance. I mentioned the 3% increase in Governor Mills's budget. You can see the full value of that appropriation over here in the blue column, about 6.3 million. We are using or proposing to use 3.5 million of that to help us balance out 2022. The University of Maine, which had exhausted its federal funds in balancing out 2021, is proposing to use about 1.5 million in reserves and other funds, about 145,000 in an early college reserve at Farmington. So overall, about 1.6 million in campus reserves and dollars. And then finally, at the University of Maine at Farmington and at Maine Law, as was the case in 2021, those campuses are requiring some system assistance to get their budgets back into balance. 1.5 million at UMF, 1.9 million at Maine Law. We think both of those campuses have plans in place, are working on those, are certainly trending in the right direction, but it does require some modest system support to get them back into balance for 2022. And then I'll note here, again, this is the 6.3 million that would be coming in the governor's budget. We allocate or propose to allocate about 3.4 million in this budget. It does leave about 2.9 million in state appropriation dollars left at 4 of our campuses, and we'll transfer those dollars into compensation reserve accounts. That shows you how we got 22 back into balance. Let me show you one more screen, and then I would be happy to take any questions. So again, I noted we used about 27 million in CARES funds to close out 21, another 5 million in 22. Begs the question, how much is left of those federal resources? Here you can see we overall in institutional funds, we've received a little less than a little more, excuse me, than 49 million in 3 separate rounds of federal funds occurring over calendar year 20 and 21. You can see here, 27 million allocated for 21, 4.9 for 22. It leaves a balance of about 17 million in federal funds. As a reminder, the funds are allocated to individual campuses and not to the system. So we do not have the ability to move the dollars around as we wish, but we do want to make sure that the available funds that are remaining are used in a manner consistent with federal guidelines, as well as consistent with the intent of the trustees. And so given these are one-time funds, we have asked these campuses to focus on developing plans that use these funds for one-time uses with a specific emphasis on facilities improvements if we can do them in a way that is consistent with federal guidance. So think HVAC replacement, things like that are perfectly acceptable. And those are the type of things that we'll work with the campuses on. I apologize for going fairly quickly, Mr. Chair, but again, this is information that the committee has seen 3 or 4 times now. Really the only change since the May version is moving in the state appropriation, moving out the in-state tuition dollars, and then by and large, campuses got back into balance using the federal funds for their exact intended purposes to cover one-time COVID impacts. And so with that, I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Lowe. Are there any questions of the committee members? And we're on multiple screens, so if I don't see your hand go up, please speak up. Hearing and seeing none, all the prep work and the previous conversations seem to have been done a good job. And I'll echo your thanks to the governor for adding the additional funds into our budget, and be a little bit early, hopefully, in our thanks for the legislature on actually putting them into the budget in the final disposition. So with that, I'll read the text of the resolution that the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee approve the following resolution to be forwarded to the Board of Trustees for approval on June 25th, 2021 special board meeting. That the Board of Trustees accepts the recommendation of the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee and approves the FY 2022 updated proposed operating and capital budget, recommended student charges, and proposed transfers from institutional reserves, including budget stabilization funds. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none. Ellen, would you please call the roll?
Certainly.
Yes.
Trustee Doak. Trustee
Yes.
Donnelly. Trustee Irwin.
Yes.
Trustee Gardner. Trustee McMahon.
Yes.
Yes.
Trustee Riley.
Yes.
Trustee Rotundo. The motion is
Thank you,
carried.
Ellen. And if we could now move into tab 2, the multi-year finance analysis. And again, Vice Chancellor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think I can keep the committee on time here. I'm going to present this morning the 5-year multi-year financial analysis. This is typically an item that goes straight to the board for discussions, but in conversations with the chair, we thought it made sense to at least preview here at the FFT committee. We will set aside time for a little bit more robust or maybe a more time for questions at the May meeting. We'll give you a chance to, May trustee meeting, give you a chance to digest some of the information, but did want to at least present a preview. And so I'll start with a little bit of history. The system has been doing the 5-year, multi-year financial analysis since 2008. We look out over a 5-year window. And so a few years ago, we adjusted the timing so that we did the 5-year, multi-year financial analysis literally right after or right when the committee was voting on the biennial budget. So, or excuse me, biennial, that's another job, the 1-year budget. And so the idea being that this committee just approved a 2022 budget. And now you can see with that 2022 budget impact, and that's the first year of the MYFA, how does it roll out over the next 4 years? It has continued to get more and more sophisticated each year. When we first started doing this, you pick out a couple of big cost drivers, you make some predictions over the next few years, and you call it a 5-year forecast. We have got to the point now where, and I'll actually give the committee a glimpse of this. We have a very, very detailed multi-tab Excel spreadsheet with literally thousands and thousands of cells of information in there from each campus. And then they all roll up to the system. We forecast enrollment all the way out through the 5 years. We look at the state appropriation and the allocation model. So we show new dollars coming in, they flow out through the model, then they get distributed to campuses. We can run, and this was a request of Trustee Irwin, we got to the point where we could run scenarios. And so we're gonna show you what the 5-year multi-year financial analysis looks like if you make a set of assumptions about what's going to happen with compensation and CPI and appropriation, but we may be wrong. And so we do have the ability to go in and do some what if scenarios and immediately see what that impact is, both to the bottom line as well as individual campuses. We can start to see campus gaps that are opening up. Even if the system number looks great, we can see a gap opening up at a campus level, gives us the ability to step in, share that information, maybe make a change now that then has a ripple impact out through the remaining 3 or 4 years. So with that, I want to share my screen here and walk the committee through this quickly. All right. Okay. So as I mentioned, we've worked on these, what I'll call these 7 levers, if you will. These are the big ones that really move the needle across the University of Maine system. We're not going to go in and predict, travel expenditures for each of the next 5 years and think that's going to meaningfully drive what the system gap numbers are. But we do know if we look at appropriation, tuition rates, compensation, benefit rate, what we're spending on facilities, and then those kind of other expenses, that it does really give us good vision into how things may unfold. And so let me just talk quickly about a few of these levers. First one is CPI. So we use a number here, 2.1%, as forecasted by the Consensus Economic Forecasting Committee. We use that because we typically link CPI with things like our tuition rate assumptions, with certain expense increases. And so that is something that we consistently track. State appropriation is our best guess, looking out over the 5 years of the forecast, looking out the 5 years of the state's, or 4 years of the state's revenue forecast. If we know revenues are going in a downward direction, then us, filling this in with rosy 3 and 4% appropriations increases wouldn't have much value. And so we try to use the revenue forecast to come up with some assumptions around here. What you'll see built into the forecast is the 3% increases that the governor has in her current budget. It's typically been our practice to request increases of somewhere in the 2.5% to 3%. And so that's the assumption going forward. But we also recognize that every time we ask for something, we don't necessarily get it. And so this is not a reflection that we're going to start asking for 1.5% increases, more of a reflection that there will be a year here or there where we're flat. And so we've leveled that off at about 1.5% in the final 3 years. Tuition reflects the 0 that was in the budget that the committee just approved. And then we've tied it to that CPI number into the out years. Compensation, we've assumed 2% in 23, about 2.5% in 24 and 25. You see the benefit rate assumptions. These two are critical because, as the committee has seen numerous times, total compensation across the system is about 67% of our E&G and auxiliary budgets. It's a higher percentage of our E&G budget. On some of our campuses, it's as much as 80% of an expense budget. And so forecasting that and getting it reasonably right is critical if there's going to be any value in the results that come out of this. Funded depreciation, what we're spending on infrastructure. This is a strategy that goes back 4 or 5 years ago, where we looked at what the campuses were spending on facilities, and at the time recommended that they grow that the next year by 3%. And then in the year after that, it went to 3.5%, and then 4% and 4.5%. And in the 2022 budget, it was a 5% increase. And so we made a number of investments in 22 over and above that 5% piece. As you know, the budget we just passed had about a 20% increase in there. Now we've got that higher base, and next year we'll look for that higher base to grow by another 5.5%, then 6%, and so on as you work through the forecast. And then non-compensation expenses. So again, compensation is such a big piece of the expense budget. And so these are the other parts. And so we've forecasted them here at the CPI number. In years past, these are categories like office supplies and out-of-state and in-state travel. We have ability to manage those a little bit better. So in the past, if you've looked at this line, in some years we've said, well, we're going to, these are going to be tight budget times, so we're going to keep non-compensation expenses at 1.5%. That's going to be one of our strategies. Given the increases that we're seeing in inflation, we actually bumped this back up to 2.1%. It may need to go even higher. It may be that we need to look at some of these numbers up here because the CPI numbers, quite frankly, are probably lagging a little bit. It's likely we're going to see that increase. And so we give all of these assumptions right here to the campuses. Then the campuses do have the ability to go in and make adjustments. They can't go in and change appropriation assumption, and one campus thinks we're going to do better than another campus, but they can go in and recognize investments that they're making in the auxiliary side of the house, for instance. And so we've talked about the investments that USM is making in its residence hall facilities. The board has had updates on what Presque Isle and Fort Kent are doing. Orono has talked about making some significant investments in the last couple of years of this, and USM is having some P3 conversations about potential opportunities on the Gorham campus. So some of those type of actions, the investments that Orono needs to make, we're putting money into engineering. Well, we need to recognize that we're going to need to hire more engineering staff. And so we recognize that on the expense side. But ideally, we're doing this so that we can increase enrollment So they can go in and reflect that increased enrollment from that program expansion, for instance. And so little bit of levers driven at the system level, and then the campuses have the ability to customize that. And then we double check that, we make sure it makes sense, and then we roll it up into a bigger system-wide number. We break that out by E&G auxiliary, and then we give you a combined number. So looking at the E&G number, you can see we're about 8 million in the budget that the committee just passed. We come down a little bit in 2023, but then the gap gets back to about the same level in 24 and 25. And then we start to see, again, I mentioned the engineering expansion in Orono. You start to see some of the bottom lines from a couple of these campuses improve with those investments. And we end up at about 6 million when you get out into 2026. The 6 million represents, you can see it on the right there, a little less than 1% of our overall revenue base. So the gap is about 0.92% of the overall revenue base in that particular year. When I've done these forecasts in the past, the gaps typically have, in positive years, have typically been in the range of, say, 2.5%. It wasn't that long ago when, say 2013, 2014, 15, when we were doing these, and the annual gap numbers were as high as $20 million a year. So we've made some substantial progress. We still haven't got all the way across the finish line, and it's really hard to measure some of this in the COVID world, but we're still in that $8 million range. If we can get this down in the 2 range, that's really the number that we're looking to get to. On the auxiliary side, again, pretty positive numbers here, really a reflection of the investments that campuses are proposing, and that's the key part, proposing to make in residence hall and other auxiliary facilities. You can see we start actually generating a modest surplus in 2024. Compare that to the current fiscal year we're in, where we have about an $18 million auxiliary deficit. So obviously with COVID ideally phasing out, we would expect that bottom line to get better, and that's actually what we're seeing right here. And then finally, the combined number, this is the big one that we typically focus on. Again, about a $10 million gap in the current year. We hover in that 6 to 7 range, ultimately ending up with a gap of about 4 million. These can change on a pretty regular, pretty easily. They can improve. Or they can go backwards just by changing an assumption or two here. So I just need 2 seconds, Mr. Chair, to bring up one more sheet. Okay, let me go back here and share my screen. Okay, so if I've done all of that right, you should be seeing a version of the same screen that, or the same spreadsheet that I was just sharing before. So you can see here's the $4 million in the bottom right. So I know I haven't picked the wrong spreadsheet. So what I wanted to show you really here was just some of the detail that actually goes into this model. I want to change 1 or 2 assumptions, and then I'll wrap up and allow folks plenty of time for questions. So I'm just looking at some of the detail that is available down here at the bottom. This shows you individual credit hour projections for each of the campuses over the next 5 years. We always talk about this. Credit hours are really what drives our bottom line. You can see, again, they are pretty conservative credit hour growth. If I can set aside Orono and Machias here for a second, you can see generally everyone is projecting increases somewhere between positive, 1.5%, down to negative 1.5%. And I think that's pretty consistent with where we've been the last couple of budget years. The numbers at Orono are much more positive. They reflect some investments in programs. And so I mentioned the engineering piece. We start to see some of those credit hours coming. So as you would expect, if you're going to get positive numbers at Orono, that's going to drive the system-wide numbers up a little bit. But in drilling down in these with the president, with Joanne, with the staff at Orono, I think we feel really comfortable about these. And these numbers feel like they make sense at the other campuses as well. Just to show you the level of detail here, this is the system-wide number for each of the 5 years of the MYFA. So you can see we have detail down here in all the detail you could want. What are we projecting to spend in professional development 5 years from now? You can actually start to see some of that information in here. I mentioned the appropriation and allocation model. So here that is, as new state dollars come in, you see them flow through the model and get allocated out to the different campuses. We have assumptions in here around shared services, and then individual campus details. And so you can see this is the Orono E&G line. Campuses, we feed a lot of this data based on those assumptions that we set on the front page. You can see those here. But then again, the campus has the ability to go in and make adjustments based on their individual circumstances. And so we have those tabs, each of the campuses, including Maine Law, by E&G, auxiliary, and combined. And then finally, I'll wrap up here by noting the individual campus details. We have that available as well. I'm going to show you one slide that shows that a little bit better. And so this is the presentation that I was just on. Is everyone seeing that? The
Yes.
UMS consolidated. Okay. So this is the system-wide gap as a percentage of revenues. So again, as I mentioned, last several years we've been kind of in this range, the 2, 2.5, 3 range. We used to be back down here. We probably would have had to have adjusted the scale. And then just let me note for a final slide. This is the rolled up numbers by individual campuses. So these are the pieces that roll up into the whole. And I think it's a pretty positive story. The pieces that I guess that I would want to emphasize on here for positives, if you look at Orono and Machias, specifically 2026, you can see they're forecasting a positive number in the last year of the 5-year forecast. UMA is forecasting positive numbers in 3 of the 5 years, USM in 4 of the 5 years. These are our 3 largest campuses. No surprise if we're getting positive numbers from there, it's going to drive the system-wide numbers. I'll note the Maine Law, which is this one right here. Again, what this really reflects is an investment from state government. And so as we move Maine Law into the allocation model, and they start to get, at first, a significant infusion of resources from state government, and then more modest, consistent growth, you can see that gap starts to go away. It's not, if we took all of our campuses and we held their appropriation flat for 10 years, a lot of gaps would look a lot like this. So some pretty significant progress here. We see the positives up here. What I'll say about the challenges in the forecast at Fort Kent and Presque Isle, I think in some ways they're, the MYFA, as you would expect, the more you drill in, the more years you go out, the more unpredictable it is. So when you've got a $570, $600 million operation and you drill down on campuses that have between $10 and $15 million budgets, and then you look out over 5 years, it's just going to be foggy at best. And so if you start off with a gap over here in 2022 and you don't necessarily solve all of it, that gap is going to roll, and in some cases it's going to get bigger. The plus side is it tends to be easier solved too. So if if Fort Kent is at about 4% here, if they get 5 new students next year, then all of a sudden these numbers look substantially better. You get 5 students here, that rolls into the next year, you get another 5. And so, I don't want folks to look at these numbers and think, wow, those, our smaller campuses are really, really struggling. We have challenges, but some of it, again, is just the more you drill down, the less reliable it gets. But we do have that data. So I thought it was important to share with the committee despite my cautions. So that's the MYFA. Again, a lot of information thrown at you quickly. We'll give you a chance to digest it all, and happy to answer questions. I think I said earlier May, but it's actually June. Later on the month when we meet, I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you, and again, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Are there any questions of Vice Chancellor Lowe? You wowed them and bedazzled them with detail. I will
Trustee
compliment.
Irwin had a question.
Oh, I didn't see him. Sorry. Trustee Irwin.
I just wanted to, again, for newer board members, because we haven't looked at this in a while. When Ryan has made this presentation in the past, he's always emphasized quite appropriately that when you're looking at out years, you're looking at what things would look like if we did nothing in response to the data that we're showing in the scenario. Again, assuming all the assumptions are correct and we didn't respond to them, this is what would happen. But we always do respond in some way or another. But what this helps us do is look at where the best levers are in order for us to close these gaps. And so, I said a few minutes ago that I'm a pessimist, but I'm optimistic about the uses of this for us to be able to identify for every campus and for the system how we can meaningfully impact these some of these gap drivers. And so, looking forward to, as we go from one budget year to the next, we should be looking for ways in which the system is proactively addressing the things that are driving the elements that keep us kind of perpetually below revenue neutral, but they are fixable. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, if I could add, Mr. Chair, it's a great, Chair or Trustee Irwin, whatever title you have now. I noticed I was running short on time, so I didn't get into the scenario piece, but rather than go through all of that background again in June, what I'll do, I'll come prepared in June and just show you what some of those scenarios look like. What happens if the economy drops out and state appropriation goes back down to 0? What if we see some modest increases in enrollment? What if something else happens? That is one of the advantages of the model. And it can be startling. Sometimes it changes in your favor and sometimes not so much, but we'll show you what some of those scenarios look like when we meet later in the month.
Chairman Gardner.
Yeah, just one real quick question, Ryan, and I know you just said you'll bring it to us in June, but just out of curiosity, as I think about this between now and June, in the model, the 5-year model, do any of the campuses get back to pre-pandemic resident hall occupation levels?
They do, and not until 23, okay. I want to say, and several actually will exceed pre-pandemic levels to the extent they're making investments in facilities that increase capacity.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. See the details in June.
Thank you. Any other questions for Vice Chancellor Lowe? I don't see any. I'll just add an additional comment that looking at the budgeting, how we're investing, and want to compliment Vice Chancellor Lowe, his team, and the presidents of each campus on the way they're coordinating, cooperating, and building these budgets so that we're investing in the real estate. And if those of us that are shocked when we read the Sightlines report for the first time, if we've looked at it over a decade, where our initial strategy was no new square footage without any square footage being removed, to looking at it more holistically, how do we invest as we go? And I'll also compliment the Chancellor for working with Vice Chancellor Lowe on building that discipline into the budgets from the system, and working with the presidents to make sure that that's in each one of the investing in our campuses as we go. It was, we were a long time getting to where we are, but it looks like the tipping point, when we get into some more of the detail of the multi-year financial analysis, starts to tip to us in making progress on that Sightlines report in that next 5 years. So it's a lot of hard work, and a lot of hard work yet to come. But I appreciate all of the hard work that has gone to get us to this point, and with our look to the future. And with that, I'll ask if there's one last time for any other questions or last comments of Vice Chancellor Lowe or the Chancellor.
I'd just say that Ryan continues to do great work, and a real joy to be working with him.
Ditto. All right. With that, this is not an action item, and we are now adjourned. Everybody have a great day, and we will see you at the board meeting.
Thanks, everyone.